golden go. Where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?
Hello, and welcome to Where Am I to Go podcast. Today we are in a city that has always kind of been on my radar. I never had any idea how much it should be on my radar. I called Sarah last week and went to set up the appointment to come here and talk about the Glore Psychiatric Museum. I thought that might be kind of interesting, but while talking with Sarah, she told me that they had a conglomerate of museums. This is a conglomerate of 5 museums that Sarah's the overseer of, and there's 2 more conglomerate of museums, and hopefully we can get some podcasts at some of those also. But I think today is going to be a full day covering what Sarah has to talk to us about, so this is going to be a continuation in St. Joseph. Anyway, welcome to Where Am I to Go podcast, Sarah. I am so glad that you decided to spend your day with me instead of the regular 2 hours or hour and a half that we spend with a podcast. And you're willing to take us through several of these different museums. Why don't you tell us about the museums that are underneath your jurisdiction?
Absolutely. So my name is Sarah Wilson. I'm the executive director of the St. Joseph Museums. The St. Joseph Museums has been around since 1927. We were originally a children's museum. We had some junior college students who had toured museums over the summer across the United States when they were on summer vacation. They came back to their teacher, their natural history teacher. Her name was Oral Andrews here in St. Joseph. And they said, Miss Andrews, we really want to start a museum. And she said, well, that sounds like a lot of work. And they said, well, St. Joseph needs a museum. So they put together a membership drive, and they started getting members for a quarter to originally start the St. Joseph Museums. The museum at that time was a natural history museum, was one of our focuses. We focused on St. Joseph history and then Native American history. We have a very large Native American collection. Over the years, we have had more museums start in St. Joseph, and some of those have gone on to be successfully private nonprofits that operate on their own. Some of them we've actually started, and they've broke off and become their own private museums. And then some of them started and they weren't very successful, or they ended up not having the ability to stay open on their own, so they've incorporated in underneath the St. Joseph Museums. So we have a very unique situation in St. Joseph where we have many museum attractions. The St. Joseph Museums Incorporated today includes the original St. Joseph Museum, so we still have that natural history, St. Joseph history, and Native American focus as one part of our museum. We also have incorporated the Glore Psychiatric Museum, the Black Archives Museum of St. Joseph, and the Doll Museum of St. Joseph. We currently operate the museums at 2 large sites, our Frederick Avenue site, which is primarily the Glore and the Black Archives and the Doll Museum, our Native American collections on display here. We also have a World War I St. Joseph exhibit here. And then we also operate the Wyeth Tootle Mansion site, which for decades was the only home of the St. Joseph Museums. And that is today operated as a 43-room historic house mansion. We do a lot of events and programming over there. It was built in 1879 and is open usually on Fridays and Saturdays most of the time over there. So it's a beautiful site. I'm excited to show it to you. It's an important site in St. Joseph history. We also have satellite sites. So right now we have exhibits over at the Iowa Sac and Fox Mission Museum by Highland, Kansas. We also have an exhibit over at Bartlett Center, which is the historic site of the only Black high school in St. Joseph for decades. So we tell the story of that. And we currently also have a free site at East Hills Mall where we have the botanicals of Lewis and Clark. So a lot to see and do.
That's all you have under your jurisdiction. And there's 2 more of these same type of setups. setups here in this city, correct?
Yeah, so the Pony Express Museum also operates, they have a historic school, a one-room schoolhouse. They've just opened up the Getz Museum, and it's kind of like a bar, but also has a museum inside of it that tells the history of the Getz Brewing Company here in St. Joseph. So that's the Pony Express Museum. That's a very popular site here in St. Joseph for people to come and visit. Patey House Museum also operates the Jesse James House. They have a large carousel inside of that. They have a Japanese tea house that's affiliated with their site. And then we have other museums like the Albright Kemper Museum of Art, the Remington Nature Center, Rubidoux Row Museum, and then the Walter Cronkite Memorial. So if you're planning a trip to St. Joseph, I guess expect to see lots of great things and spend quite a few days.
And how many 911 calls does the operator get for people that are having bad cases of museum overdose?
I don't think we've ever had any of those.
No museum overdoses?
No museum overdoses.
This is unbelievable.
Yeah, we do. We have per capita more museums than most cities in the United States, for sure.
That's just, it is unbelievable. I mean, and I've been impressed. We've been staying in Kansas City, or Independence actually, and we have been running like crazy the last 4 days, trying to see everything that we could see that direction. And we still have a list that's got another 20 museums on it to go see. This place is incredible with history. But there again, the history here started, not started, but really expanded as far as being the starting point for like the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail, a big center of commerce for cattle trade. And there's just so much here that happened here. And I guess it only stands to reason with that much history that you would have this many museums.
So St. Joseph has a beautifully rich history, and you know, the historians here in St. Joseph, we get lost in it because it is just fascinating, and it feels sometimes just like that it never ends. We learn new things every single day. Kind of a brief history, I would suppose, is, you know, prior to European settlers coming here, a lot of Native American tribes had been pushed into the area. We had prehistorically what you would classify as Oneota culture was living here. And when we go upstairs and we look at the archaeological collection, I can show you some examples of an excavation from an Oneota site, the peoples who were prehistorically living here. But by the time European settlers get here, like Joseph Rubidoux, who's our town's founder, he was a fur trader, a French-Canadian fur trader. The people that were here, like the Iowa and the Sac and Fox, and we also had Potawatomi, Kickapoo, a lot of them had been displaced by Western expansion that was already happening coming east. And so some of those tribes are from like the Great Lakes regions, but they had been pushed here by the earlier 1800s.
Okay.
And so then they were living in this area. But the St. Joseph area had been considered kind of sacred ground. It was kind of a place where, you know, there were supposed to be no wars that happened. It was kind of where tribal councils would come together and meet and discuss things. And so a lot of different groups were always kind of coming through this area. And especially by the time Joseph Rubidoux comes as a fur trader, there's lots of different types of native tribes that are in this region. So one of our favorite stories is of Geoffrey de Royne, who was a black man who was a slave of Joseph Rubidoux's. He spoke, I believe, like 13 different languages.
Wow.
So he spoke French and English and Spanish and then several different tribal languages, and he was able to help Joseph Rubidoux with his fur trading because a lot of these tribal groups didn't speak the same language, so they were using a lot of sign language and, you know, making languages that they could speak to each other at that time. So it was a lot of just different types of people that are coming through here. When you think of like European settlers from all different parts of Europe that are coming through, we have African slaves that are coming in. We have all of these different types of Indian tribes. And so in the 1800s, St. Joseph was really a cosmopolitan place where a lot of people are coming through. The exhibit we just put up at the Iowa Sac and Fox Mission Museum is on Rudolf Frederick Kurz, who is coming all the way from Switzerland up. So he travels from Switzerland down to New Orleans, up the Mississippi River to St. Louis, and then over the Missouri River up to St. Joseph. And he comes here specifically to draw the native peoples, and that's in the 1840s.
Okay.
And so he's getting here right around the same time as the California Gold Rush. And an interesting story about the California Gold Rush, and as you alluded to, we're one of the major jumping off points as people are heading west for Western expansion, is James Wilson Marshall, who is credited as kicking off the California Gold Rush, leaves from the St. Joseph area. He actually crossed the Missouri River up by Amazonia, which is just about 10 miles north of St. Joseph. And he heads out to Oregon and then down to California. And so when he discovers gold, the word gets back to St. Joseph quicker than any place else. And so people start flooding out west for this, gold fever. And so more people leave through St. Joseph in those prime gold rush years, 1849, 50, and 51, than any place else. So while everybody's going out to California to strike it rich and make their fortunes, there's people who come to St. Joseph and really become the people who make the money.
Right. They're selling the wagons. They're making the wagons and all that stuff here too, right?
Yes. And so the Wyeth Tootle Mansion, which we operate, which is a longtime home of the St. Joseph Museums, was home to two of those families, the Wyeths and the Tootles. And both of those families really made their fortunes outfitting people heading west to make their fortunes, make their lives. And they were selling dry goods, lumber, nails, all of the things that people would have needed to go out west and build their lives and build their fortunes.
Wow. We're going to have to go visit that site too. Okay, now we're here to talk about the Psychiatric Museum, but we've got a lot of history beforehand. Mm-hmm. But I want to make a point that when you first come into this museum, as you walk through the doors, to the left, there is some restrooms. And these restrooms are rather, what do I want to say, impressive? Tell us about your restrooms.
So I will say our restrooms have been ranked in the top 10 museum restrooms in the United States this past year. We really have a creative staff. We have creative people doing creative things. And one of the things that we have done over the years is just done some fun exhibit design in interesting places. And so one of the interesting places that we have created exhibits is our bathrooms. And so the 4 bathrooms for the Psychiatric Museum, one is the phobia bathroom. And so there's a gigantic clown that greets you when you go in. We have one that
scares the pee out of you.
Some people just open the door and they turn around and they leave and they choose another option. We have the Freudian bathroom on first floor, and then up on second floor we have the optical illusion bathroom, and then the other one is the haunted bathroom, because we always have people asking us the question, is the Glore Psychiatric Museum haunted? So
of course it's not. Nothing bad happened here.
We're going to find out.
So this museum isn't just a great place to come to, it's also a great place to go.
Yes. Yes. You can have that experience in the restrooms, yes.
Okay.
So we have kind of set the stage telling the history of St. Joseph. And so we were able to amass a lot of wealth here in St. Joseph because of our unique geographical position and as people were heading out west. And so right around the time that our state hospital was built, so 1874, right? This is post-Gold Rush years. St. Joseph had a lot of power, a lot of wealth, and state hospitals were seen to be something that would be very beneficial for communities.
Okay.
So I'm going to take you back a couple of decades. So in the mid 1800s, there was a lady, and let's walk down this way.
Sure.
There's a lady named Dorothea Dix. She's a big advocate for people who are mentally ill. She tours prisons on the East Coast of the United States, and she basically makes this observation that a lot of people who are being housed in the prisons were mentally ill. And she says, well, these people are sick. They should be treated in hospitals, not treated as criminals.
Okay.
So she begins to lobby the governments and the states to create state-funded hospitals that would care for people who are mentally ill. And she has quite a lot of success. So most states in the United States have multiple state hospitals by the time it's all said and done. But it really comes about because of her advocacy. So in 1851, she was able to start a state hospital in Missouri, which is in Fulton, Missouri, and that becomes the first mental hospital west of the Mississippi River.
Okay.
And after a few years, Fulton gets overflowing. There's too many people. And so they look to create another state hospital. And St. Joseph at that time, this is 1870s, has enough political clout and money and wealth and power to successfully lobby to have it built here in St. Joseph. The way these hospitals were built at that time is largely based upon the Kirkbride architectural plan. Thomas Kirkbride is an architect as well as a psychiatrist. That's him right there.
Okay.
And what he was wanting was to create large buildings that would be stabilizing for patients. So if patients are coming, they wanted them to have a place where they would come that would make them feel safe. And he wanted them to have lots of windows so people could get the benefits of sunlight and fresh air. So they would build the main center building and then they would add on staggered wings.
Okay.
And so that you would get the sunlight and the fresh air. So this is basically what the Kirkbride plan looks like, where you have these staggered wings so you can get the maximum benefits of the natural world. So this is what our state hospital looked like at its kind of prime, with all of the staggered wings, the center building. Originally, his intention was to build state hospitals that had no more than 250 patients.
Okay.
Ours got up to nearly 3,000.
Right.
So he also wanted them to be built outside of the cities. So St. Joseph was originally downtown by the river, because the river was the main means of transportation. So our state hospital was located outside of the city, kind of in the rural country setting. So the idea and the intention was that people would come to these state hospitals and that they would have be able to rest and get better and then go back to their home communities. That was the original intention.
How well did that work?
Well, yes and no. You know, there are some people who ended up in the state hospitals that were never going to be able to go home because biologically they just would probably not have the capacity to do that. But then, you know, you're thinking sort of industrial revolution. There's a lot going on. The cities are very busy. They're dirty. So people were mentally getting fatigued. So coming and having a rest like that could have been very, very beneficial. We were originally called the State Lunatic Asylum No. 2.
State Lunatic. Is that politically correct?
Well, at some point in time, people decided that no, they wanted to change the name. So then we became the State Hospital, or St. Joseph State Hospital. But I mean, obviously state meant we were state funded.
Right.
Lunatic was coming from the idea that the moon influences our mental health, right?
Okay.
That's where lunatic comes from. And that was the common term for people who were having mental health issues at that time. And then asylum, right, meant safe place.
Right.
Is that what you think of when you hear the word asylum today?
Not anymore, because I've heard too many rumors about the psychological asylums that actually may have been worse than the prison that they were in. I don't know that for sure, but I'm sure we'll figure this out as we're on our tour.
As we're on our tour. So, you know, in the United States today, we definitely have the notion that asylums were scary places and were not necessarily asylums safe places, that there were some things that were happening that were quite scary. And some of that is true. Not all of that is true, but some of it certainly is true. And the reason is because you have an institution that was built to house 250 patients that gets up to nearly 3,000 patients. We go through World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II in the United States. So what happens is the trained doctors and nurses get taken towards their war effort. During the Great Depression, there's just simply not as much funding. Funding gets diverted towards the wars. We have people who are coming back from the war with syphilis or shell shock, PTSD, what we would call that today. And then we also have just so many patients. So it's kind of the worst case scenario where you have too many patients, not enough doctors and nurses, and not enough funding. And so the system gets really stressed, and it is very, very stressed for decades. And so there are some very scary times in our history just because of the way things were funded. Okay.
So what proportion of doctors and nurses ended up not thinking quite right themselves and ended up having to stay in the asylum? That had to have been a really mentally draining job, dealing with people that are having these kind of problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And it still is to this day.
I'm sure.
I will tell you. So the state hospital here in St. Joseph has never closed. We do have a facility across the street. It's a 108-bed facility. You have to be sentenced there by a judge. And they generally run very understaffed even today. I remember when I first started working here, we had a presentation about the history of the state hospital. And at that time, we had at the end of the presentation, a couple of people came up to me and they said, this lady used to work here as a nurse. And they looked at her and they said, tell her what you did here. And the look on her face that I saw is what I would consider somebody who has suffered traumatic stress. And she just looked at me and she, like, very deadpan, said, I did whatever I was told to do. But you could tell that she had seen and had to do some pretty uncomfortable things. So absolutely, yeah. It was probably a very difficult place for people to work. They saw a lot of hard things, for sure.
I'm sure. Well, just having to be around crazy people all the time would drive a person that direction, I would think.
Yes, and we've had changes in patient right laws. We've had patient, informed consent, at many, many years of our hospital's existence, patients did not have the right to be, they were involuntarily held here against their will, and they did not have the right to give consent for treatment. So treatments were
forced upon them.
Yeah, forced upon them. And they would have been at sometimes very invasive treatments that we now know today were probably not all that beneficial to them at that time, like lobotomies.
I was going to say, who writes the consent form to, I want to be lobotomized?
Right, absolutely. So, you will see over the course of the tour, we had lots of very experimental very experimental treatments, because they're learning as they go what works and what doesn't work. And the human brain is incredibly complex.
Oh, yes.
And so even this question of what causes mental illness is as unique as each person's individual brain. And so they're trying things like electroconvulsive therapy, insulin shock therapy, lobotomies, all kinds of different water hydrotherapies were done. And then, around the 1950s, we start to develop pharmaceuticals that we're giving our patients, and those are very young pharmaceuticals that don't have a whole lot of research that had been done on them, so they're really learning as they go along.
That's a rough way to do it, too, especially when you're experimenting on other, we've got guinea pigs.
Yes, and probably we had human beings who maybe were poor or didn't have the same amount of respect or rights. So they were, in maybe some cases, treated as subhuman.
Right.
So yeah, it's an interesting story for sure.
Well, let's go take a look at some of your displays and see what all's here in the museum.
Absolutely. So in this room, we talk about not just what happened here in St. Joseph, because it's amazing that we have this here in St. Joseph, but it's not just a St. Joseph story. It really is a national story about state hospitals. And so in this room, we talk about the state hospitals that were in Missouri, because we actually had 5 state hospitals in Missouri. We were just state hospital number 2. The unique thing about us is we were able to preserve that history and share it for everyone. But as I said, Fulton was state hospital number 1. This is a restraint cage from Fulton.
Okay, now we're going to describe this restraint cage. This thing is like a dog kennel that's about probably 8 feet long, 2 foot wide, and 2 foot tall. And it's got a lock on top. You open up the door. I'm sure they shove somebody down there, maybe in a straitjacket if I'm going to let my mind wander. And then you're stuck inside this cage. You can't stand up. You can't sit up very easily in here. You're going to be laying down throwing a fit. That's not cool.
Yeah, so it is literally a large metal cage. And this actually, I've been told, could have held 3 people at a time.
No.
Because they would scrunch them down and just 1, 2, 3 line them up. But so
your neck would have to be kinked in order for that lid to close.
Yeah, it would
but
not
there
have
again,
been
they're not afraid to put people into straitjackets where they can't move either, which just my own experience. If you're someplace where you have no movement and you're just confined, it just adds to the panic. So you go from crazy to crazier.
It certainly would not have been a comfortable experience.
Oh,
no.
man.
No, not at all. So this is from Fulton, and that's State Hospital number 1. We already talked about here in St. Joseph, we're State Hospital number 2. This picture here is from the Nevada, Missouri State Hospital, and that was State Hospital number 3. And
the picture is doctors and nurses all lined up in the typical work of the time picture, so that you can see who all the employees were.
Yeah, so you have all of the nurses and the doctors in white in front of the large Nevada building. This is from about the 1930s. And I do like this quote from one of our doctors here. It says, "It's easier to keep well than to get well." And that was his thinking at the time in the 1930s as he was going through his studies, how important it is just for us to keep well. Because once you go down a road of addiction or, a lot of times, especially in the 1930s during the Great Depression, people were being malnourished.
Right.
And so that impacts your brain. Your brain is part of your body. And so if we're not keeping well, somebody ended up here, then you have to try to get them better, and it's sometimes harder to do.
Well, just stress. I mean, going through stress can create depression. It can create all kinds of things. And we live right now in a pretty stressful situation to where I'm surprised. Well, I shouldn't even say I'm surprised. Drive down any city street and you see people that are suffering from mental problems, whether it's depression, drug abuse, or whatever, and they're all over the place. They're not being put into hospitals anymore, I don't think. I don't know what the situation is, but they're there.
Right.
For all of us to see.
So you're hitting on an important question, and that's a big question that we talk to our visitors about and ask, is we went from state-funded institutions, and lots of them, in the United States. We had 5 in the state of Missouri. We went through some changes where we realized that those state-funded hospitals were not humanely taking care of the patients. They didn't have the resources to do that. So for a time, the federal government stepped in and they were helping pay for some of this treatment. And then by the 1980s, during, we have Reagan economics where they downsized the federal government. They stopped doing that. So the federal government at that time says, we're going to defund these hospitals. And so the idea was at that time, we were going to fund community services. So mental health was going to be funded at the community level. But what happened is we've never successfully put that infrastructure in place in the United States where we're getting funding to communities to care for people who are mentally ill. So what is happening is a lot of people are not getting access to health care, mental health care. And so today in the United States, about 20 to 25% of our prison population have been diagnosed as being mentally ill. And prisons are the #1 providers of antipsychotic medications. And so our state hospital that was here, the whole campus, right, today is a correctional facility. It has been converted. Farmington, which is State Hospital #4 in Missouri, has also been converted to a correctional facility. As I said earlier, we went from 3,000 patients. Across the street, we have a 108-bed facility that is a state hospital, but you have to be sentenced there by a judge, which means you've been found not guilty by reason of insanity, you've committed a crime, or you're going to hurt yourself or somebody else. It's pretty apparent. So the resources at the state level to help people who have mental illnesses are very small. We do have, like at our hospital, there are some mental health treatment services, but people who have severe depression or anxiety or severe mental illnesses generally aren't able to work. They generally will not have insurance. And so, I ask our visitors a lot, like, do you have a friend, a family member, or a loved one who has a mental illness? And almost 100% of us do. We all know someone.
I was going to say, ask me. I'll admit to it.
Right. And the other question I ask is, so where do they go for help?
Exactly. The thing is, you go to your local psychiatrist and they just drug you. Where do you go for help? I don't know. But a lot of the people that you see on the street, they're beyond the local psychiatrist point. They're walking down the street, cussing at themselves or talking to themselves or whatever, and it's really kind of a eye-awakening, boy, am I thankful feeling, I guess. Yeah.
So one of the big questions that we ask people to just think about is, who should be responsible for people who are mentally ill? And one of the interactives that we have here, the options are kind of, should that be up to the individual? Should that be up to their family? Should that be up to the community? Should that be something that the state takes on or that the federal government takes on? Because we've tried different things. We tried the state. That didn't work because we did not have enough resources allocated. The federal government said this is really, really expensive. We've never allocated enough resources at the community level. So right now we're at a place where I think oftentimes individuals and families are trying to care for people who have mental illnesses, but we're not doing that very successfully. If you couple that with we're coming out of a global pandemic where people were living under stress, fight or flight survival mode for 2 years, which the human brain is never designed to do.
Right.
We're seeing higher rates of mental illness in the United States. If you look at our teenagers, the amount of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation in our teenagers, some of it's because of technology, social media, some of it's just they're living in a stressful world. It's a fast-paced world. We're seeing increased rates of mental illness, but lack of resources to serve. So we're having really important questions. So we just had 225 middle school students that came through this last week, and we gave them really good tips to talk about how to deal with and cope with stress and understand what's going on with their brains and how, ways that they can get help.
Right.
So we are doing that on a daily basis, is having these conversations, starting to focus even more right now on our teenagers because they need those resources. But it's important for us to understand historically how we got to where we're at right now so that we can figure out what we're going to do, in the upcoming years.
Looking at the past for the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of questions there. Maybe I shouldn't have gone that direction, but we did.
I think it's an important conversation to have that comes up naturally here.
And the solutions are so unpredictable, I guess, or speculative. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for. You can speculate as to dumping more money into it. Does that solve the problem? Do drugs solve the problem? Lobotomies, whatever, but the solutions are so varied, I guess, because brains are so varied.
Absolutely. I mean, we do know a few things, and actually we'll have a room up here that I'll show you that will help with some of that. We may just go straight there and then come back. But what we've been really focusing on, especially with our teenagers, is just coping skills, which we all could use better, you know. And so the latest thinking right now has a lot to do with what's called adverse childhood experiences. And so the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more likely you're going to be prone to a mental as well as a physical illness as you age.
Okay.
So if you have a death of a parent, or if you have addiction in the household as you're a child growing up, or neglect or abuse, the more of those things that you have as a child, the more likely you're going to be prone to a mental and physical illness as you age.
Okay, but just to take the counterpoint on this, people 100, 200, 300 years ago, death was an everyday part of life. Your parents died, orphanages, all of that stuff was an everyday part of life. And yet our mental illness, I would think, wasn't nearly as severe as what it is now, or maybe the people just learned to cope differently, or maybe everybody just understood it to where it's not as forefront in our minds as it is now. Is it we are becoming weaker as people, or is it, you know what I'm saying, or where I'm trying to go with this?
Well, we just live much differently now than we did, say, 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So if you think about humans, and my degree's in anthropology, so I do think a lot about humans.
Here I'm talking to a museum person, and we're supposed to be doing a museum tour, and I'm going down all these rabbit holes that, but I'm curious.
So think about, as human beings are, early human beings are living. So you're living outside in nature.
Right.
And if you need food, you go fish for it, or you go get the berries off of the trees, or you go hunt for it.
But how much easier is it to go to the grocery store? So they had extra stresses because they weren't eating all the time on a regular basis, whereas we can go to the grocery store and provide dinner at 5 o'clock.
So, but in that scenario, not the grocery store scenario, but the living in nature scenario,
right,
food is all around you. Like in Missouri, the people who were living here, they had abundant food resources.
Okay.
Food was all around them. We're one of the most lush places possible. And so there was plenty of food. They would just go and find it. Every single day you wake up, that's your job. You go find food, right? And then you eat, and then you do whatever else, you know, that you need to do to keep warm. But you're just surviving, right? You're just living in that kind of mode, but you're very connected to the earth and the planet and all of those things. So it may sound terrible to us because it's easy for us to go to the grocery store, but the food that they're eating is actually healthier for them.
Oh, most definitely.
Right? They've developed the food around them that they needed to live healthily. And so we have a tremendous amount of obesity. We know that in the United States. We have a tremendous amount of problems because of the way that we are connecting with our food.
Right.
Which is different than, was happening 300, 400 years ago.
I think even connecting with family and everything else creates problems also.
Does it create problems, or does it create good things too?
You know, when they were living as family units, and grandma was there, and mom and dad, aunts, uncles, whatever in the local community was one thing, but when people start spending all their time in front of a television or in front of a phone, and that becomes their social life, and they're not interacting with the touchy-feely, seeing emotional responses and some of that kind of stuff, I think what it does is it alienates a person. And some people like to be alone, but I don't know that loneliness is necessarily a good thing.
Well, again, I'm an anthropologist, so I can assure you that human beings are primarily fundamentally social animals.
Exactly.
And so when I give tours, a lot of times what I tell people is, have you seen the Tom Hanks Castaway movie?
Right. Yeah,
so he's by himself.
He bonded with a soccer ball.
And why did he do that?
Because he needed the social.
Because you need social. So during the pandemic, when we are all quarantined, that makes people very sick because we need to have social interaction. If we don't have social interaction, we as human beings get quite ill. One of the interesting things over here is the solitary confinement. And so before the advent of medications, if you had a patient that was going to hurt themselves or hurt someone else, what are your options? And so what they would do is they would lock them in solitary confinement by themselves.
Right.
But knowing how important it is for us to have social interaction, if you take a person who is having delusions, who is depressed or suicidal, and you put them in solitary confinement by themselves, it's going to make that problem that much worse. Our brains do not function without human interaction. Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway goes crazy.
Right.
Because he needs people. People need other people. It's very, very important. So
we're
you're
back
absolutely
to that little
right.
box down there.
Yeah.
But I guess there were 3 of them shoved in that little box, so at least they
Yeah.
had social interaction versus the solitary confinement. But here in your solitary confinement room, you have a patient that's in a straitjacket, sitting in a chair with nobody else, all
Yeah.
by himself.
Yeah, and so you're absolutely right. Where when we are cutting ourselves off from other human beings, whether it's watching our phone all the time or watching TV, and we're not having strong family groups and social groups, it makes us sick.
Right.
And we're seeing
mentally
that.
and physically.
Yes, mentally and physically it makes us ill. There's an author who wrote a book called Bowling Alone, that started to realize, I think back in the 1990s, even probably early 2000s, that as Americans we were becoming more and more isolated from each other. Whereas we used to get together at people's houses and have games of cards, or we'd go out bowling and have bowling leagues, people were doing less and less of that. And as we see us having less social interaction, we have the breakdown of our communities and our societies. We start trying to replace that with online communities, but it's not the same biologically as being in the room with a person.
Exactly. Or in the city park with 500 people listening to the town band play.
Yeah.
Or the parades and festivals that all these towns used to have that now have 20 people show up.
Yeah, so if you want to think about your mental health, right, and your physical health, and this is what we're teaching some of our middle school students, is just go outside, spend time in nature, spend time with people that are strong and supportive and caring, right? Spend time with each other. Be connected to the food you eat. Make sure that the food you eat is healthy, right? Drink plenty of water, get exercise. It's easier to keep a person well, right?
So what you're saying is that the solution to mental illness and people going down that path is a community garden.
Well, we do have a community.
You get your hands in the dirt,
Yes.
You're providing your food,
Yes.
You can be socially active with other people. So the community garden sounds like the perfect solution.
So we do have a community garden at the Wyeth-Toodle Mansion. We're very involved with that. It's down in the middle of the Museum Hill neighborhood, and we have an amazing group of people who are doing a community garden, because this is a very healthy thing to do.
Are they mentally ill?
Who isn't today? To what degray?
So I'm just wondering if my theory holds water.
Some of those people have suffered some loss. Like they've lost children to fentanyl overdoses in the last couple of years. They've gone through divorces, and so they've gone through traumatic life experiences, and so they're trying to get healthy by doing some of those things like yoga,
right?
and all. Those are good, healthy things for us to do. That does not mean that those things are going to fix every kind of mental illness.
No.
Because there are some mental illnesses that are just fundamentally biological, right?
Or hormonal, or
yeah.
Yes.
And so, not every mental illness is going to be fixed by these things, but a lot of the way we cope with stress can help us be more physically and mentally well.
Okay. Now, we came up a series of stairs. We're now standing in a hallway that is very, very long with several different rooms. I guess you could equate it basically to like a school house with a big hallway with lots of rooms off to the side.
So it was a hospital.
Right.
So we're actually standing in the former medical, surgical, and admitting building of the state hospital.
Okay. And
so we have some pretty cool exhibits here on the second floor. Some of my favorite exhibits, actually, and probably some of our most popular.
Okay, but as we're doing this, there's an old television with a whole bunch of letters in it. What is the purpose of that?
So we had a patient in the 1970s who got the idea that messages came out of the television, like he could get in contact with the outside world. So he thought if he put messages into the back of a television, he could talk to people on the outside world. And so he would find any kind of piece of paper that he could and write a message and basically saying the same thing, like, this is my name and this is my social security number and I'm being held at the St. Joseph State Hospital. There's a boxcar of my things. There's money in it. Can you come and please break me out of here? And so he would just write that letter over and over and he would put it in the back of the television until one day the television started to smoke.
Uh-oh.
So they unplugged it and they got in there and they realized that he was cramming these letters in there. And so, yeah, that's that story.
Okay, and at the end of the hall, you have a box that's probably 8 foot tall, 3 foot square, and it's full of cigarette packs.
So that's another patient that we had.
He smoked that much?
I don't think he smoked all of those, but at that time, a lot of people smoked, probably more than they do today. And he somehow got the idea that there was some kind of a contest where if you collect over 100,000 cigarette packages, that you could turn them in for a wheelchair.
Oh.
And so he very meticulously, with the help of some attendants, collected all of these cigarette packages. And then, like, he got way over 100,000 and he's like, where's this wheelchair? And so the attendants that worked here, they looked, they couldn't find any kind of contest. I don't know where he got that idea from, but they did put their money together. They pooled their money and they bought a wheelchair and donated it to the state hospital in his name.
Wow. Was he happy then?
I think so, yeah. Another one of the really impressive exhibits, and probably our most popular exhibit, is the stomach contents display.
Oh. Well, as we're walking down this hall, there's all kinds of artwork on the wall. Was this done by patients? Or?
So Arthur Kraft, this is work in particular by Arthur Kraft, who was an internationally known artist. He was treated at the state hospital for alcoholism in the 1970s,
Okay.
and so this is some of his work. This is the stomach contents display.
What?
Yes.
No.
True story.
No. Okay, I'm looking at a display case that's probably 3 foot by 3 foot, laying flat, and this is the stomach contents. But in this stomach contents, I see thimbles, I see buttons, I see nails, I see hair pins, nuts, bolts, cotter pins, screws. This was all in people's stomachs.
This is all in one person's stomach.
Not one person.
One person.
He didn't walk past a magnet without getting stuck, did he?
It was actually a girl.
She didn't walk past a magnet without getting stuck, did she? Holy smokes.
So this is right around the 1910, 1911. We had a patient here, and they knew that she would ingest things. They tried to keep an eye on her, but she got sick. And when she passed away, when she passed away, they did an autopsy on her and found all of this stuff in her stomach.
I didn't think a person's stomach could hold that much.
Well, probably not healthy.
No, but she definitely didn't have an iron deficiency.
That's true. So the disease is called pica, and that is just the ingesting of non-nutritive substances. And sometimes it's affiliated with people who have a disorganized family structure. We do know that she was an opioid addict. That's how she came to the hospital originally. But altogether, there's 1,446 objects that were removed from her stomach. The doctor who performed the autopsy, Dr. Harlow P. Mills, decided that he thought it would be interesting to create this display, which looks very much like a mandala, a work of art.
Yeah, it's really pretty.
From the contents of her stomach.
My mind is blown. How much could she eat? I mean, and it never, none of it passed?
Oh, I'm sure some of it probably did.
This is insane. Wow. How many years was she eating that stuff? Do you know?
Well, she died when she was 30 years old. Actually, she died on her birthday at 30.
Wow. And it didn't puncture her stomach or that. Never mind. Let's look at something else that's a little bit more enlightening, like the lobotomy room.
I'm not sure that that's the choice for enlightening. But it's a pretty interesting story. So we do know that lobotomies were performed at the state hospital here in St. Joseph.
Did you have a nurse named Ratchet?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
But it's interesting that you bring that up, because in the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, in the book, they lobotomize eventually the main character.
Right.
Basically because he was not behaving.
Right.
We had a doctor here. Her name was Dr. Mary Frances Robinson. She was a student of Walter Friedman, who is the infamous lobotomist that lobotomized tens of thousands of patients in the United States. And we do know that Walter Friedman came here to lobotomize patients because Mary Frances Robinson wrote a book with him called Psychosurgery in the Self, and she also wrote a couple of studies. And in the case studies, they are trying to see whether or not lobotomies were advantageous. This is very experimental at this time.
Let's describe a lobotomy real quick, because I know it has something to do with scrambling the brain, but I'm not totally up on what exactly they did.
Okay. Well, there are two different types of lobotomies. The original lobotomy would basically drill a hole into the side of the head. Okay.
Like through the temple?
Yeah, right here. Okay.
Okay.
And
not okay, but okay.
Then they would take the tool basically and just go side to side. So those are one type of lobotomy. That's the original type of lobotomy. That's a surgery, and you would need a surgeon to do that. And that was developed originally by Igaz Moniz. When Walter Friedman brings the lobotomies to the United States, that's how they're originally performing the lobotomy. And in fact, they do that lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy. So she's the sister of John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. And when she was being born, the labor was delayed because the doctor was delayed getting there. And so the nurses basically held her in the womb. And so she had alcohol deprivation. So she would have always been a slower adult.
Okay.
Okay, because of that. Well, when she's in her 20s, she was living at with some nuns at a convent, and she got caught sneaking out.
Okay.
And her father thought that she was going to embarrass the family. And get pregnant or something. And so he had Walter Friedman lobotomize her, and she was one of the earlier...
Her dad?
Had her lobotomized, yes. Because they didn't know what lobotomy was going to do, but they just thought it would make her behave better, I guess. And so they were very much experimenting, and so they drilled into the brain, and they had her awake, and so they would have her do things like cite the Lord's Prayer or sing God Bless America, and when she would grow fuzzy, that's when they stopped. And they ended up vegetating her. And so she ended up in a wheelchair and ended up in hospitals for the rest of her life. And so Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy become really big advocates for reforming mental hospitals, because their sister was in one.
Wow.
But she was the example of sort of this side drill into a lobotomy. But Walter Friedman wants to be able to do this. He's maniacally believes that lobotomy is going to save all of these people, because this is in the 1930s and 40s, and so state hospitals, as we talked about, are overpopulated, they're underfunded, they're understaffed, they're filling up, and nobody knows what to do with this, and so they're desperately searching for a solution. And they're starting to understand that you could do brain surgeries, and if there's a mental illness, like the problem is in the brain, and that's sort of the initial brain surgeries. But they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what different parts of the brain does, and so they're just experimenting. So he develops what's called the ice pick lobotomy, because you could do it quicker and without anesthesia. And
Why do I cringe when you say this?
So they would use electroshock therapy to knock people out, and then they would put the instrument, which is called the orbitoclast, up through the eye socket. And then
Through the eye socket.
Yeah. You may want to edit some of this out.
No, just keep going.
If it's too much. So they would put it up through the eye socket, and then they would just move it around, and it's just kind of swooshing your brains around, basically. And then they would pull it out. So what would happen is sometimes people would get better, right? For whatever reasons. And sometimes people would get much worse or die. Because it was obviously and often causing brain hemorrhaging.
Right.
And you're...
look at what a stroke does to a person with just a single blood cell being clogged, and here they're stirring all that stuff up.
Yeah. So going back to Mary Frances Robinson and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So she's doing scientific research on these procedures that Walter Friedman's doing at our state hospital. And the building that we're attached to, our south building, that's where lobotomies would have been performed in the 1930s and 40s. That's the surgical building. The way they chose their candidates for lobotomy is they chose the 16 worst ward behavioral problems.
Okay.
So the people that were causing the problems were the candidates for the lobotomy experiment.
Okay.
And what they found after the lobotomy, because what they were measuring was, do lobotomies make patients better patients? Not do lobotomies make patients better, but do they make patients better patients? Which means after the lobotomy, will they sit down if I tell them to? Will they get dressed when I tell them to? And what they found was yes, after the lobotomy, people would listen better, but they could no longer remember their last name or use the bathroom for themselves or count to 3. So it basically took somebody who had a mental illness or was insane and turned them into an imbecile.
Wow.
So what Mary Frances Robinson says is, because of the research that she was doing here at our state hospital, she said the cost of lobotomies is too much. And so the state of Missouri bans lobotomies pretty early on because of her work. They decide that lobotomies weren't everything that Walter Friedman was touting them to be. But he continues to lobotomize patients until the 1970s.
Wow. And in this room, okay, I'm gonna describe this room. No, I can't describe this room. I'm gonna talk about this room because you've got a surgical table that's all stainless steel, has the lifts and whatever else on it, all manual. You've got a skull with a great big piece of doweling sticking through it that says replica of Gage's injury. Now, is that somebody that had a sliver in his head?
So Phineas Gage, who is this young man over here, was tamping dynamite to lay a railroad in Cavendish, Vermont in the 1800s. And the dynamite goes off and it shoots the tamping iron through his skull. And
okay, now you have the tamping iron here too, or a replica of it, which is like a spud bar that you pack the soil down around your fence post or something, but it's got a super sharp point on the other side. Okay, so he's tamping the dynamite.
And it goes off and it goes through his skull. And so they find a doctor, they get him to a doctor.
He's still alive.
He's still alive. And they get the tamping iron out, they suture him up, and he lives. And this is an early case of somebody having a very traumatic brain injury and living. Okay. And so if you think about your human brain, the back of your neck, right? These are your very, very important life functions.
Right.
So this is where your breathing, your heartbeat, all of those things happen.
They refer to that as a reptilian brain?
Sure.
Okay.
That's like the oldest part of your brain.
Okay.
And so if you make a fist, basically, this is your brain, this is your brainstem, this is your oldest part of your brain. If he had damage here, he would have surely died.
Okay.
Okay. This part of your brain after that is the social part of your brain, and it develops next when you have young children, right?
Okay.
That's where you're having mothers cuddling babies and things. And so if you have babies that are neglected when they're growing up, this part of the brain does not develop correctly, and that's kind of sometimes how sociopaths develop, because they have no empathy.
Okay.
They don't feel other people's pain. So in order for us to have healthy brain development, the social part of your brain, which is inside, needs to develop next, okay? And then you have your lobes.
Okay.
This is your top part of your brain. Evolutionarily, that's what's developing last in humans. This is what distinguishes humans from a lot of other animals in the world. We have these gigantic big lobes, frontal lobes, and those are things like mathematical reasoning, calculation, our ability to think,
right,
and come up with
to
solutions.
Process.
Yeah, that's right up here. So when your brain feels really busy, right? That's the part of your brain that is talking to you and doing things. And it takes a lot of energy. Your lobes take a lot of energy. So if you're thinking a lot, you have to also eat a lot. And so those develop hand in hand with us transitioning to becoming more meat eaters too, because meat gives you that protein to really use that brain. So
that's why you can't sleep, Linda.
So when you do meditation and yoga, which I teach a lot of, what you're simply doing is you're asking your frontal lobes to be quiet. And you're just living in that original part of your brain that allows you to feel better and relax. So you just you control your frontal lobes. You can tell them to be quiet. I know not everybody feels that they can, but I assure you, you can.
Right.
You can do that. And so if you want to live in a happy, meditative, even state, ask those frontal lobes to just relax a little bit, and then you can be more calm. So what this injury did to Phineas Gage was it went through his lobes.
Okay.
And so people realized we can have a severe brain injury to the lobes and still live, right? And so what they start eventually doing is lobotomies, which is a surgery on the lobes. But you know, Phineas isn't the first that knows this. During the Civil War, you have people who are having brain injuries that they're trying to operate on, somewhat successfully. So these are some different drills that were used around that same time. In the archaeological record, we see trepanation, and we're seeing that they're doing some kind of a head surgery. I wouldn't classify this as a brain surgery, because what you see often with these trepanned heads is healing around the bone, which means after this brain surgery, when the bone is healed, that person is still alive.
Right.
So your brain has your skull, and inside the skull, there is a sac around your brain, and then your brain is inside. They're just cutting into the skull on this, and then
like to relieve pressure or something.
Yep, absolutely. So somebody falls and bumps their head, they're having headaches. They might open a part of the skull so it could have more space to expand, and then they would still live sometimes. If they poked into that encasement of the brain, then at that time they would have had all kinds of blood to death, certainly, and also infection. Yeah. So once we start to be able to control how we can suture things up, right, and then also infection, which is kind of where they're at with Phineas Gage. Like, you could suffer a huge brain trauma and still live, So then they kind of take this knowledge and develop it, and then they start looking at lobotomies and trying to see like what does actual brain surgery do. So lobotomies were just simply a very experimental brain surgery. They didn't know what they were doing. But we still do brain surgeries today. Right? We just know a lot more. And the reason we know a lot more is because we unsuccessfully did lobotomies.
Like 40,000 of them, it says.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're looking at a case that she was just talking about with a drill that looks like a hand drill with several different bits. We've got something that looks maybe like a corkscrew drill that has a handle on it that you can turn and it'll bore a hole through your head. And then back in old times, they have like an arrowhead that's shaped. It's big though. It's probably 4 inches round on a curved blade with serrations on it and a T-handle for cutting into skulls. Then we get over here to this lobotomy cabinet, and she was talking about the lobotomy pick. This thing's probably, I'm going to say 15 inches long. It's got a little T-handle at the top that you could put in the palm of your hand with a couple of finger holds and run that through somebody's eye socket. But it must not have been easy because they have a little metal hammer that's also stainless steel that I guess is for driving that stake through the head.
You can
several
very clearly
different
see that
pictures on the
process up
wall
there.
of people getting lobotomies. The thing that's really noticeable about this to me is these pictures have the surgeons all in tank tops instead of surgical gowns or anything else. They don't really look like doctors. They look like they're out of Egypt wearing a toga or something. They've got electro shock machines in here and some other surgical tools and a pretty good explanation as to what the lobotomy is. And I am basically pretty well freaked out, but that's just a personal problem. You guys don't need to worry about any of this. It's just my deal. Now, we come to another display in this room that is a box with a chair in it and a place for you to stick your head out. And there's a whole bunch of dials. I'm not sure what those are, but she's going to explain this to us. It's a fever cabinet.
Okay, well, so certainly coming out of the first 2 world wars, we had a lot of patients that were coming here with syphilis.
Syphilis, okay.
Which, I mean, most of you probably know syphilis is an STD. And that makes sense. Guys go overseas and they bring back syphilis home to their wives and girlfriends. So
welcome home.
Yeah. So the tertiary, third phase tertiary syphilis, the bacteria that causes syphilis starts to eat at your brain.
Okay.
And at that time, we didn't have penicillin. So the only way they could figure out to treat syphilis effectively was to put people in these fever cabinets, and they would hold them there above 105 degrees for several hours. Because if you have a high fever, right, that kills off the bacteria.
Okay.
So they were basically causing a high fever in these syphilis patients, and it would kill off the bacteria that causes syphilis, and then they were able to get better and go back home.
So it did work?
That was the way to cure syphilis.
That was the way to cure syphilis.
And you were able to bring the body temperature up enough that the blood was warm enough that it'd go through your brain and get rid of the bacteria.
Yep.
Those bacteria would cross the blood-brain barrier then. Interesting.
Yeah, so that was uncomfortable, but it was really actually very successful. And lots of people so about 10% of our population had syphilis, so about 300 patients a year could be treated like this and go home and get better, which is really huge at that time. 1940s, penicillin becomes popularly used, and so we don't have to thankfully sit in fever cabinets anymore.
Right.
To cure syphilis, but yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. And then we've got the lobotomy. Is this a lobotomy room?
This is electroconvulsive therapy and other shock therapies. So electroconvulsive therapy was one shock treatment that was used. It was actually one of the later ones developed. And it's basically just using electricity to shock the brain.
Okay.
And reset it. So,
And how effective was that? The look on your face doesn't look real promising. We're looking at a pair of clamps that have a big C over them with something that would look like headphones that's hooked up to an electric machine that's plugged in. And I'm sure they can dial that up to intense and maybe not so intense. If they didn't think you were quite crazy, they could just put a little bit in there. And if they thought you were really crazy, you got the whole dose.
So I'm going to just start by saying and reiterating, a lot of therapies were performed on patients without their consent. Okay. And they were very experimental. And so it's not until the 1960s or 70s in the United States where we have voluntary, involuntary confinement laws and patient-informed consent laws. So if you go to the doctor today, theoretically, you have to consent to treatment. Many of our patients did not have the ability to consent or not consent to treatments. Electroconvulsive therapy is still used in the United States today. If you are going to go to a doctor who wants you to have electroconvulsive therapy, as a patient, you should really look at the pros and the cons of that treatment, because electroconvulsive therapy is often used on people who nothing else has worked. So they've tried changing their lifestyle, they've tried medication, stuff is still not working, and they're chronically depressed to the point where they're going to kill themselves, let's say. What they might do is order electroconvulsive therapy, and it will reset your brain. And then hopefully by the time your brain goes back to wherever it was, you will have found a better treatment solution. Electroconvulsive therapy is not a long-term solution. It's just a reset of your brain, and it does cause long-term permanent damage. It's not like memory, you'll have memory loss and things like that, but it's usually short-term memory loss. So my caveat is electroconvulsive therapy, still to this day, we don't really know why it works or how it works. It just sends an electrical pulse through your head, resets, you might feel better for a little while, and hopefully you can find other treatment options in the meantime, but there are other permanent things that do happen as
well,
part
at least
of it.
the thing that's nice about it is your short-term memory is wiped out, so you don't remember it happening.
Perhaps. Today they use anesthesia. They didn't always do that.
Sorry.
And then there were some other different types of shock therapies. Metrazole convulsive therapy was used, and that is like causing a seizure with metrazole, which is a chemical. And insulin coma therapy, which was like, if you know somebody who has diabetes, they go into an insulin coma. They were creating a false insulin coma and letting them revive, and it was quote unquote resetting the brain.
Wow.
But a lot of people would die from those treatments.
I'm sure.
Honestly, so.
And then we could have a shock therapy with a doctor and a guy that looks pretty dang crazy.
Yeah, so
Wow.
they're just they're learning as they go along.
Okay, now we've got another room with a hydrotherapy shower, wet sheet treatment or cold pack. So you've got a bathtub in here, and you also have a bed. I'm assuming that was this cold water that they used, or?
So in this scenario, this would have been a warm water bath. Just calm, relax you, just like a warm bath does today. This is a cover, so that would keep the bath water warmer longer.
Right.
And so they would just put people in there, a nice warm bath, relax, right? That's not terrible.
No, that seems all right.
That seems all right.
They didn't hook electrodes up to the tub or anything?
Not in this case, no.
Wow.
Now that shower is probably less comfortable with the guy that they're spraying the water on all over the place. Another just different form of hydrotherapy. And then wet sheet treatment was basically, they would strip a patient down, and then they would put ice cold sheets around them, and then they would put a woolen blanket over them, and they would strap them to the bed. And this was supposed to calm patients down.
Oh.
My opinion is, if this were done to me and I can't move and I'm so incredibly uncomfortable, I would get mad and I would go to sleep. because there's
Okay.
nothing else you can do.
Right.
And so you would just lay there and go to sleep and be pissed off.
Yes.
I've read accounts of patients who've had this done to them, and it was very uncomfortable.
I would imagine being strapped to a bed wouldn't be my choice of things. Okay, so now we've got a toilet seat in here on a wooden bench, kind of a lot like an outhouse seat with armrests on it. What kind of therapy is this?
That would just have been a toilet that would have been used on the wards.
Okay.
This is a colonic irrigation table, and for some reason, they did a lot of enemas on our patients.
Wow.
There's some rectal dilators and things over there. We kind of jokingly refer to this as the room of ick.
Yeah. Rectal dilators.
Yes, so
I'm sure that has something to do with the
I'm not
mental
really
discomfort of
sure,
people.
but yeah.
Okay, you've got a camisole. I thought it was a straitjacket.
So that's an old version of a straitjacket. Those were sewn by our patients here at the state hospital. The material that it's made out of is mattress sticking. So they were using the same material they used to make mattresses for the straitjackets. And it's called a camisole because it laces up the back. But that's a very early form of a straitjacket.
And the material looks a lot like a prison uniform. That's striped. Like you said, a mattress cover.
Very much like a old blue and white striped mattress.
Right.
These are various restraints that were used here at the state hospital. Vests and muffs and mittens. That's a ring that was in our tunnels. So all of our state hospital buildings were connected via a tunnel system, and that ring was found down there. That's
a restraint ring that was stuck into the concrete wall, probably to hold people while they. Dang.
Yep.
This is just a brutal place. I mean, really. Look at the leg restraints and the arm restraints and being tied to chairs. Early tranquilizers. Those look like switches my dad would have used when I wasn't behaving.
Yeah, so, if you were working at the state hospital, you would have a club that you would use to subdue patients or protect yourself if something happened. This is George Glore and the patients. So, one thing I really want to impress upon everybody is the Glore Psychiatric Museum is created by George Glore, who is our founder. He was the occupational therapist at the state hospital.
Okay.
And he started working on these exhibits because the superintendent in the 1960s asked him to create some displays that talk about the history of mental illness for a Mental Health Awareness Week open house. And we'll see those displays in just a minute. And so he did that with the help of the patients. And then they encouraged them to keep creating. And so the Glore, one of the reasons why it is so incredibly unique and there's nothing else like it on this planet, is George Glore had the patients create the museum as part of their occupational therapy.
Oh.
So right here, where it says early tranquilizers, and you have the clubs, and the modern tranquilizers, which is medication, this is created by the patients and George Glore as they're creating the hospital.
Okay. Wow. And we're looking at a belt that's tied up with, or folded in half and has surgical tape over it. Actually, it looks like all of those are, the top three are belts that have been put together with surgical tape, and they could be swung like a club because they'd be pretty solid. And then the bottom one is an actual club, it looks like, maybe wrapped in rawhide or waxed yarn or something like that. And they thumped people with these things to try and knock them out, or just to try and get them to calm down. I know that getting beat on just calms everybody down.
Well, I'm sure there's some degree of, social dynamics of power that come into play.
Right.
And so, you don't have medication. Sometimes you would have patients that would have manic episodes. They might hurt themselves. They might hurt somebody else. They're trying to get them into solitary confinement or a straitjacket or wet sheet therapy. The patients don't want these treatments.
Right.
One of the lobotomy candidates, they go to shave his head to have a lobotomy, and he ran away. And he ran back to his home, and they go and they find him there, and they pick him up, and they bring him back to the hospital and lobotomize him. So, these clubs are used to force people to have treatments that the doctors maybe thought that they needed to have, that the patients did not want to have.
Wow. And then you've got a dental room with a dental chair and drills and teeth pullers and all kinds of other dental equipment. And it says that dentistry was a cure for mental illness.
So in the early 1900s, we're just starting to understand the relationship between infection and illness.
Okay.
Dentistry at that time, dental hygiene was not great. And so what they begin to think is, if you have a fever, right, you become delirious sometimes if you have a high enough fever. And fever and infection are linked. And if you have infected teeth, right, and those are close to your head where you're having problems, perhaps it's the infected teeth that is causing your mental illness. So at a lot of our state hospitals, they were pulling out a lot of patients' infected teeth. And in fact, people out in the community could identify, like, you had stayed at the state hospital because you don't have very many teeth left. But they were thinking maybe pulling out those infected teeth would cure your mental illness. They do the same thing with other organs like spleens.
Right.
And, well,
tonsils.
Hysterectomy.
Right.
So a hysterectomy, removing a woman's uterus, was thought to cure hysteria.
Okay.
That's where the term comes from, hysterectomy. So all kinds of different, just trying to understand what's causing the mental illness, what can we do to help. And there are some things today that we think just sound absolutely insane, but there was a medical basis based on their knowledge at the time.
Okay. Now we're into the EEG. Nope, you're going to have to tell me. EEG. And we're looking at a mannequin laying in a bed with a covered sheet on with probably 50 wires attached to his head in different places, and a little stimulation machine. And
so EEG measures the electrical activity in the brain.
Okay.
And so when this technology is developed, everybody at the state hospital was pretty excited because they thought they would now be able to measure and tell different types of mental illnesses. So if you have a person who is depressed versus a person who is bipolar or schizophrenic, maybe by having their EEG readings, we could diagnose these things and try to understand more. The answer to that is you cannot tell from the electrical activity in a person's brain if somebody is depressed or bipolar or schizophrenia. So that leads us to the knowledge, right, that electricity in the brain is not causing these things.
Okay.
You can tell if somebody is awake or if somebody is asleep, if they hit REM sleep. You can tell if somebody's having a manic episode, right, they'll have more electrical activity, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're manic depressive. Anybody having a manic episode is going to look exactly the same. But we were doing lots of these brain scans with the EEG machine, just trying to understand our patients' brains. The thing that I think is really important and interesting about these sorts of things is just to talk about how complex and unique the human brain is. There is nothing else that we know of that can ponder itself and create tools to measure itself
right
in the world. And each one of our brains is unique to each of us. And so each mental illness, right, is going to be unique to that person. So when we talk about how complex mental illness is, there's biological factors, right? There's social environmental factors. There's perhaps chemical factors that are going on. So today we treat a lot of mental illnesses with pharmaceuticals. And a lot of people say because it's a chemical imbalance or it's a chemical issue.
Right.
But while that serves pharmaceutical companies very well, it's not just. Rarely is it ever just a chemical issue. There's a lot of complicated things that are going on.
Wow. Okay. This is just so fascinating and interesting and bizarre. Yeah, I'll go with bizarre. This is, I mean, you always hear about mental hospitals or mental institutions and lobotomies and that kind of stuff, but you guys have this displayed so well with the different treatments and the different aspects. It's just phenomenally cool. This is another restraint cage.
Yes, this is called an Utica crib, and Utica was a state hospital in Utica, New York.
Okay.
So this is an Utica crib. That's this design. That was also a restraint cage.
Now, both of these look just about like jail-type coffins.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you were stuck in here, you probably maybe kind of wished you were dead or something, but that's about the size that they are.
About the size
And
of a person.
So you'd be just stuck in there.
Yeah.
There's not enough room between the dowlings or anything else to really get your arms out. This one over here's got a heavy chicken wire over the top, or a wire mesh that looks kind of like chicken wire.
This was from a hospital in Topeka, Kansas, and they used it for a restraint cage. And then a new administration came in, and they didn't want to restrain the patients anymore, so they moved it to the kitchen and made it the potato bin.
Oh, okay.
And then that's a restraint cage over there too. And then this one is a stand-up version of a restraint cage where you just lock somebody in a stand-up cage.
And again, that's even angled like the old coffins.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's narrow at the bottom and wider at the top, and there's a hole that you can look out, but I think if you scream too much, they can drop that little slide door down over the hole to where you can't see out either.
Yes.
And what about this big round drum?
So this is a hollow wheel. This was developed by Johann Christian Rehl, who coined the term psychiatry in 1808. And this was his cure for mental illness, is you would put somebody in there and spin it and make them run and run and run until they got tired out.
And this is probably 8 foot, I guess, maybe 9 foot round,
Mm-hmm.
with a little tiny door that you could crawl through, and then they put you on the rat wheel,
Yeah, hamster wheel.
the hamster wheel.
Yeah.
And they physically made it turn to where you had to keep running,
Yeah,
and then finally you'd get tired enough that it didn't matter anymore.
I guess, yeah.
Wow. And then you got, of course, the
Pillory or stockades.
yes, where you put your head through and your hands through, and then people can throw stuff at you because you're mentally ill.
Yeah, or, witches burned at the stake. And this is a a dowsing tub, and that's a form of shock treatment or hydrotherapy too, where you
Cold water.
shock them back to their senses. Same thing over here with the bath of surprise, where you have somebody up on a platform and then you drop them into ice cold water. And
I've seen those at fairs.
Yeah.
You throw the ball and
Yeah, so hopefully makes you feel better.
They usually do that to the mayor or something, so I guess that explains that mental illness too.
Oh, yeah. So lots of different ways that they have historically tried to treat mental illnesses. Many of them probably would not hold the scientific weight today. Blistering, where you take a scalding hot iron and you would put it on the face of a woman trying to cure her hysteria.
Ah, that'd be like branding.
Yes.
Everybody in town would know that she had hysteria.
Yeah, and I don't think that it would make me less hysterical if you did that to me.
Oh, heck no. No more so than saying something like, calm down.
Right. Probably not, yeah. Putting people in dungeons. And then stomping or stepping on patients.
What?
Other restraint devices. Bloodletting.
I don't even understand how the thought process goes that if you can find somebody, isolate them, or shock them, or stomp on them, or put coverings over their heads, that is supposed to cure a problem like that you're already having, a mental issue. I can't comprehend how that reasoning crosses over.
I think some people just want to control, and it's a way to control and put fear in people.
Well, it's like, how many psychopaths did you have to hire in order to take care of the psychotically ill people?
Well,
it's like the insane are in charge of the insane asylum.
Yeah, so I mean, when you talk about the doctor who creates a mandala piece of art out of the stomach contents of a patient, or when you talk about Walter Friedman, who is forcing people to be lobotomized and seeing that they're dying and bad things are happening, but so fervently, maniacally suggesting that this is going to be the cure for everything, you do see, like, wow,
I can understand the doctor making the mandala out of all the stomach contents. That's an intriguing. How in the world did that get there? And people
Right.
ought to see this. I mean, this real? I can comprehend that much more so than the forced lobotomy. That guy has to be a psychopath in order to do that. Or the people that are pouring cold water on people or strapping them down and confining them and then creating comas, or so many of these things just seem so unhumane.
So have you heard of, I think it's the Stanford prison experiment?
No.
They take, it's widely cited in different social theory literature where, like, say you take, I don't remember if it was 15, so say you have 30 students, college students, this is probably in the 1970s, and they randomly selected out of these 30 students, 15 to be the prison guards.
I have heard
and
of this.
15 to be the prisoners. And so the ones who are the prison guards go and they set up the prison, and then the 15 prisoners, they go and they round up and they put them in this make-believe prison. And within days, they have made the conditions of living so horrible, right, that eventually they have to call off the experiment because the prison guards become so power hungry and malicious to the prisoners. The things that they are doing are so horrifying to the prisoners that they have to call off the study. And it's 30 normal college students.
Right. And then did they flip those, and the ones that had been...
They stopped the experiment entirely.
Okay, I thought that they flipped it and they found out that the ones that had been abused turned around and abused just as badly.
So you'll see, to create inhumane living conditions tends to be very easy to do. For people to try to be more powerful over other people is kind of a scary, ugly thing that sometimes in the human condition we do to other people. And so we have to be very aware when we have institutions like prisons or state hospitals, orphanages, things like that, where you have a population of people who doesn't have very much power and you have other people who have power and control over them, that there are checks and balances in place so that those things don't get out of control.
Right. And then you have people like Mendele over in Nazi Germany that everybody condemns, but it looks to me like they were doing the same things here. The lobotomies.
Certainly.
It's just amazing.
Yeah, certainly the eugenics that the Nazis are using actually is developed in the United States. And the Nazis read about it and pick up on it, and then they use it incredibly terrifyingly, terribly.
They amplify.
Yeah. But that eugenics, the theoretical idea behind eugenics was developed in the United States, and we were doing this stuff at RCI. Like at state hospitals, they were forced sterilizing people.
Oh yeah.
Because they didn't want them to reproduce.
I personally know a lady that was sterilized that was awesome with kids. She'd come over and play with my kids all the time, but she was sterilized because she had epilepsy. And
yeah,
the lady, like I said, the lady I know would have been an excellent mother because of the way that she interacted with my children. She was 75, 80 years old 20 years ago, but kids always looked forward to her coming over, and it was great, but she could never have kids because they forced sterilized her because of epilepsy.
And you get like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and you get all kinds of, like some of the poor funded hospitals in the South that would have been primarily Black people that were in those state hospitals would have been more likely. Walter Friedman would have gone there and performed lobotomies on them. So there's a lot of power and social dynamics that come into play when you look at the populations that were here, and whether or not they had a right to deny therapy, or if they had therapies imposed upon them that shouldn't have been, whether they just ended up here because they didn't have power not to end up here. They may not have been crazy. They could have just, like women, for instance, for much of our history, a husband could just drop his wife off here and say, she's crazy, take her.
Well, like the lady that we were talking about with the Kennedys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, we got a tranquilizer chair.
So this was developed by Dr. Benjamin Rush, who is known as the father of psychiatry in the United States. And this is basically a chair that I would assume somebody would be expected to sit at for a long time, since there's a toilet in the bottom. You would strap down their arms and their legs, and then there's a contraption over the head that would sensory deprive them, so they couldn't see or hear other stuff, and then they would just sit them there, and hopefully that would help cure whatever mental illness they have. Benjamin Rush was also a very big proponent of bloodletting, and so he probably would have also bled them while they were sitting in this chair, hoping to replenish the good humors in the body. He was a physician for George Washington, and some people say the reason George Washington died was because Benjamin Rush encouraged them to bleed him too much. So that was
I've heard that.
Yeah. Back here is a really cool lion from the State Hospital in St. Louis. That's part of that building.
From the wall.
Yeah. So this is on the building of St. Louis when it was torn down, and it ended up here. So that's pretty cool.
You guys got lucky to get that. It's one of the big lions or big heads that you would see on top of a building that is probably 6 foot tall and 4.5 foot wide. That's really ornate woodwork with a lion head and some wings and brush coming out. Really kind of a neat piece.
Yeah, he's super cool.
And that was off of the mental hospital there?
Yep. The State Hospital in St. Louis.
And that's tore down now, I'm assuming?
Part of it. Part of it still exists. And then this is the O'Halloran swing, where somebody would sit in there and be spun and spun and spun around, kind of like, this is George Glore. Yeah, this is a picture of George Glore in it in 1968 when they made it.
No. They've got a hand crank on what looks like a hand drill and a box that they would put you in, strap you in, and then just sit there and spin you till you were so dizzy. Mm-hmm. Whoa! And
then this right here is sort of a whole history of psychiatry timeline, going back to, this is the 1700s. So this is mesmerism, right? So hypnotism. And then straitjackets developed in 1790. Phrenology, that's touching and feeling people's heads. 1796, really popular in the 1800s. Here, 1874 is our state hospital when it's developed.
It's really a majestic looking building.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
so this was the original one that was built in 1874, and it actually burns down. And so they build a new one, and it burns in 1879. So just 5 years after it's built, it burns, and then they rebuild it on the same footprint, but this is the second version of the hospital.
Okay.
So 1886 is when Freud is practicing. So we're built, right, before Freud is even practicing.
Okay.
And then you get things like Pavlov's dog, IQ test, and then EEG, when we start to develop lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy. And then medications don't come about until 1952, which is when Thorazine is really used to treat our patients. And, that's a big shift. And they call this a chemical lobotomy.
Okay.
And Thorazine, of course, has lots of side effects. So it caused something called the Thorazine shuffle. So a lot of times when we think about people who have mental illnesses, there's some stereotypical traits that we have, like they're like shuffling around and maybe like sticking their tongue in and out of their mouth, or they're like scratching themselves. Those are all side effects of Thorazine. And so here at our state hospital, we were doling out lots and lots of Thorazine to our patients. And so they would have those side effects in the Thorazine shuffle.
Wow.
Yeah, it was an early medication. They don't use Thorazine today, hardly at all. And then, you have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That theory comes about in 1954. And so we start to think about what does a healthy human being look like, right?
Right.
So, kind of up
this
into
is
this
a pyramid
point.
that has at the top self-actualization, then it's self-esteem, then love and belonging, safety, and physiological. And so, is that psychological?
So physiological. So physiological is
throws me off.
Your physical body needs to feel like you're fed, you're taken care of, right? You're safe.
And that makes a well-rounded person.
And so it builds on it. So if you are physically safe and taken care of, and then you have love and belonging, right? That community, right? And then this starts to get to how do you have a healthy mind, self-esteem, and then our whole goal is self-actualization, self-realization. So like you said, why do people think that beating people or locking them up is going to make them better? Well, they didn't know, I guess. I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me, like if you treat people well,
right,
they're going to be well. But these theories today, multiple intelligences, the way people learn and grow and develop, this is what all of the modern theories about psychiatry are based upon, is taking care of people, taking care of the whole body, the physical body, as well as the emotional, social, spiritual body well. And that's how you create a whole, well human that is ultimately going to become self-actualized. Right.
Yeah. No, to think that demeaning people and tearing them down is going to make them better is ludicrous.
Yeah.
Okay, we're walking back down the long hall. Now, is there another floor to this?
There's
also?
one floor up, and there's a basement. And then we have a tunnel, and that's all of the Glore Psychiatric Museum.
So there's 2 more floors to this museum that have displays on them.
Yes, but they're much smaller than this floor.
Okay, because we're running long, but I'm enjoying the heck out of it to where I don't want it to stop.
Okay.
What's going down this way?
So that is where our Native American and history galleries
okay.
are.
We're going to cover that
archives.
another time.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we're walking up another flight of stairs. Now, did they have elevators in this?
Yeah, we have an elevator,
And I'm sure they had a cafeteria and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, absolutely. So after the introduction of medicines like thorazine, we start to prepare our population to be able to get better and go back out to their home community. So for many, many decades, patients were really going to probably live out most of their lives here once they ended up here. Like they would say, bring the clothes you want them to be buried in.
Really?
Yeah. But by the 1950s, we start to be able to more effectively treat some of these symptoms with medications. So up here we have music therapy, and you can see just sort of some of the things that the patients would have done. They would have had bands.
They've got a drum set, they've got an electric guitar, a couple of electric guitars, acoustical guitar, saxophone, keyboard, piano, record player, bells for ringing all the different bells. And so they would actually bring them in here, and music therapy I could see would be really, really good.
Right. And then also art therapy. And so these are various, all of this is patient art up here.
Okay.
And so this is Robert. This is a self-portrait by a guy who had schizophrenia, and he would always wear headphones to keep the voices out of his head, like help him.
Was there music playing through him, or he just had it on silent?
Yeah, he would have music on. So that's his self-portrait. But there's a lot of self-portraits. This is one of our more popular pieces. This is an embroidery piece by a patient who was diagnosed with schizophrenia here at the State Hospital. And she didn't talk, but she could. She would talk if she was very upset, but mostly she didn't talk. And so they would give her towels and things to embroider on sheets and stuff. And
wow.
So this is basically a window into what life was like at the State Hospital.
And she's got words embroidered. That's all that's embroidered on here that I can see is words. But she's got like...
So this right here says, what kind of cake will you have, white or chocolate? I'll take chocolate. What kind of drink? Grape or strawberry? I'll take grape. Would you like a napkin? She's just talking about a cake and punch party that they had at the State Hospital.
And it's all embroidered. That had to have taken her 2 hours to write.
Probably, yeah.
Or 3 or 4. I'm not an embroiderer, but I know that it's pretty fine sewing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Like she talks about she's lonely and she misses her husband. Wait for me. And she has music like Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Santa Claus is coming to town, so you better not pout. And then like I always think this is interesting because it says hair on fire.
Uh-oh.
I really believe she probably saw somebody with their hair on fire.
Wow.
Because those sorts of things happened here.
Wow. I'm amazed that you can read it because there's all these words, and if you look at this, all you see is a bunch of words, and they're written out in such a way that when she's reading this, she's going left to right like she should, but she may be going down 4 or 5 rows in just like single word or double words, and then the next sentence starts, but there's words on both sides, to where if you were reading straight across, you'd say, "Burr the day we tore success, Wecca now." Anyway.
I know. There's a lot going on, and you have to kind of find it. So up here on 3rd floor, we had 3 surgical rooms. As I mentioned, this is the surgical part of the hospital. And so this is the x-ray viewer and where they would plug in the oxygen, and down here on the floor there's a drain. This was a surgery room.
Okay, and you've got some uniforms for the staff, a Red Cross uniform.
So we talked about psychiatric nursing and what that looked like at the state hospital. So we talked about how important socialization and human interaction is. A lot of our patients, once they were dropped off here, you know, their family or friends probably didn't ever come see them again. So one of the key ways that they would have interacted with other human beings is through the nurses. And so we do talk a little bit about how important that relationship would have been. And then just sort of the history of psychiatric nursing. We talk a little bit more here about Thorazine and the side effects of Thorazine, because that was a lot of what, you know, certainly in the later years, the nurses were doing is they'd come into their shift and they would administer all of the medication. And then this exhibit is actually called Ward Quiet, because they would come in and they would administer all their medication and then the ward would get really quiet.
Okay. And you've got a medication tray here that's really interesting looking. It's just a wood tray stand, and it's got snow cone papers, like what you'd get your snow cones at the fair. And I guess they put all the medications in there and then just passed them out according to room. Wow.
Yep.
And you've got an old refrigerator,
Yep.
1930s. It's almost like an ice box with a robot head looking thing on top is where your refrigeration
and they would have
components
stored
were.
medicine in there. You will see some of the pictures will have the nurses with the armband number 2, and that's just the state hospital number 2.
Now, did they have a ward dog that hung out here to help the patients? Pets would have been really good. I think pets would have been better than lobotomies.
Absolutely. I know. I think that's that little nurse's dog. I don't know if she brought him here every day. We do have pictures of some of the patients with a cat that they used to have. And I know we have a picture down the hallway of a guy that would just feed the birds and make friends with the pigeons and stuff. So this is a picture of the nurses scrubbing the floor of the staircase. The staircase that's downstairs that we started on, that's the picture of what that staircase looked like when it...
And it's a very ornate staircase. It's really cool.
And you can see how it's open. So when the prison moved in, they tore it out. We had several patients that committed suicide by jumping off.
Oh, really?
Of that, because it was really open. So they wanted to close it up, and so that's why they tore the staircase out, and we have it.
Okay. Huh. Just so uncoolly cool.
Some patient art here. This is the 4 Faces of Alcoholism. We were definitely an alcohol and drug treatment facility. I think this is probably an Arthur Kraft And he was treated here for alcoholism. And this is another interesting picture with, you have the sort of drunk person laying in the street and the sort of shadow family off to the side.
Right.
And over here we have the chapel. The Warwick Chapel was started in 1956 and was very key in the treatment of alcoholism here at the State Hospital.
Now, this was before AA?
Sort of as AA is gearing up and getting started, yeah. They start to realize like this, acknowledgement of a higher power could be very beneficial to treating addiction.
Now, I want to go back to a sculpture piece that you have here that you called the Four Faces of Alcoholism. Mm-hmm. This is a small bust type piece of art that has 4 different faces, like on each side. So you've got the eyes from one come into an eyes of another with a smile and then despair. And it's very interesting the way that they sculpted that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was fascinating.
I wouldn't have known that's what it was had you not told me. But once you say that, it's obvious that there's 4 different faces on that top pedestal.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, we're kind of breezing by a lot of stories, because if I were going to tell you every single story, we would be here for days. There's a lot to see and take in, and every item, every painting, has its own story. This piece right here, the guy painted a self-portrait because he felt like he was evil. Oh. And so it's kind of a small little round blue ceramic portrait of a head with fangs and horns. Yeah. And, this is another one, very happy. So one of the things I encourage people to do is they were talking about their feelings and expressing themselves, the patients were, through their art. And so to look kind of closely at each piece, think about who was making it, right? Why they were making it, how they were feeling when they were making it. These are eggshell mosaics.
Eggshell?
Yep, mosaics. So they would use the eggshells from the kitchen to make a picture.
Wow. That is amazing. They needed some Americana chickens that had the Easter egg colors, but these ones here are brown eggs. Well, there's some blue in there, and there are some different colors, but they're brown and cream and white for the most part. And they were able to make, I guess it's a Japanese man in traditional wear. It's all out of eggshells. That's crazy. It is beautiful.
Yep, they were.
And is this one here eggshell also?
Nope, that's made out of stones.
Oh,
but that was very popular. In the 1970s, that would have been a very popular thing to do, as was the string art.
Okay, I remember everybody was doing string art at the time.
And then there's a baby blanket. This was made by the women on the violent ward. They had a nurse that took care of them that was getting ready to leave on maternity. And so they all made a quilt block and made a baby blanket for her.
Wow.
And this piece is called I'm Sick and Tired of Being Sick and Tired.
Really? And that's a clay piece that's just a pedestal with a mouth and a great big tongue hanging out.
Yep, it's like blah.
Wow. This is so cool. And it's neat that they had these types of art things. Now this was a later edition, right? As far as doing all of the art? Or was that something that was going on in the 20s, 30s, and 40s also?
So, this basket over here, this little tiny jar right here is from about 1900. Okay. So that is the earliest.
It's a woven piece.
Yeah, that's the earliest patient art that we have in our collection. This one says it's from 1926, but a lot of this stuff is coming from later post-Thorazine. I mean, they probably always were making some things, but they really get more into that.
Well, it just seems like the art would have been such a good therapy, the music and stuff too.
Yeah, so we have rocking chair therapy.
Okay. That'd be relaxing too.
Yeah.
And you've got probably 10 different styles of rocking chairs, from wicker to leather seated to just wood.
Yeah, so these are obviously older versions of rocking chairs. like some of the earliest ones. This chair here is in this picture, so I know it's from the 1900s, like right around 1900. This is what the state hospital was originally designed to be like. So these guys are playing billiards, and they're socializing, and like they're here in this very opulent setting, which is designed to make them get better and go home.
Right.
But like, so this is early 1900s, like right around 1900. But then, you know, by the time we get to the 1950s and 60s, we have this version of a state hospital. So like all of these women are heavily medicated on Thorazine in this picture. Their hair's cut because there was probably a big lice problem. See all these beds are lined up?
Right.
We'd have like 100 people living in one of these rooms, and they would like have to crawl over each other to get to their beds. There was exposés in Time magazine and Life magazine and in newspapers that start to talk about how deplorable the conditions in the state hospitals are. Because, you know, like one of the articles I read, like literally a patient had their fingers gnawed off by rats. Like
really?
The situation got incredibly bad, like really, really bad. And so that's when the federal government steps in. The Kennedys start really advocating for reform. So the federal government steps in and they start to say, we need to regulate this. We need to make a change.
Wow.
And so they start to fund for a few years in there, some supplemental funding from the federal government to the state hospitals. And then by the 1980s, they say, we can't afford this. It's so expensive. And so then they downsize and pretty much deinstitutionalize almost all of the state hospitals in the United States. So their idea is thinking, we're gonna let people go back home and be taken care of at home or in their communities, but we haven't done a great job of putting any resources for people to get access to. This is one of our patients with a cat.
Right.
So you were asking about pets. So we did have pets here. We also had lots of children. You know, we had children that were born here. We had children that lived here. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the basement. But
okay. And then you've got a floor drag, and it says these heavy drags were used to polish ward floors as recently as 1955. A patient assigned to drag might have to pull it for hours before he was allowed to rest. This was intended to keep the patient occupied as well as to keep the floor shining.
So all of our patients were pretty much expected to work if they were here. So we had a kitchen, we had sewing rooms, and I'll show you some of those in the basement. But you know, everybody had a job, and so some of it was cleaning the floors, some of it was working the farms. The state hospital was designed to be entirely self-sufficient.
Wow. Well, let's go down to the basement.
Okay.
Is that where all the scary stuff happened? It looks to me like the scary stuff was everywhere you went.
You know, a lot of good things happened at the state hospital, a lot of bad things happened too.
Wow. Okay, now earlier we were talking about hauntings. Mm-hmm. And as we're walking down the stairs, you want to chat a little bit about that?
Do you guys prefer to take the elevator or the stairs? I don't care.
It doesn't matter to me. Let's take the stairs, and you can talk on the way down about, you have haunted tours here, or is it just something that people speculate on?
So just about every weekend, we have people who rent out the museum to do paranormal investigations.
Investigations, okay.
Yes.
And what are they finding?
Well, if you go online and you Google Glore Psychiatric Museum and paranormal or ghosts, you can find all kinds of things on YouTube that people find.
Okay. How about you? Have you had personal experiences?
So I work here every day, so I'm very respectful of our friends you can't see.
Right.
And I would say most of our staff are the same way.
Okay.
So we just have, we just are very respectful with any kind of energy that might be about. I have seen stuff on paranormal investigations because we're here, when they do them, that I can't explain. That is pretty interesting. I don't think people are ever disappointed by what they find here.
Do you do the paranormal tours like a lot of places do, or do you just have the YouTube videos and the paranormal explorers?
So we have something that we call Glore After Hours.
Okay.
That we have a private company that comes and they help provide that experience,
Okay.
because they teach them how to use the tools and things.
Okay.
We have other people who rent it out and do their own investigations or lead investigations with other people. We have done overnights that we allow people to come, and we give them sort of the history of the state hospital, and then also they get to spend the night here and ghost hunt all night long. They always have fun experiences.
Cool. Okay. Is that something that you offer through your website?
You can call, yeah,
Okay.
for sure. We have an events page on our stjosephmuseum.org website, and you can look it up or call, and we can let you know when the next one is, or if there's one being planned or whatever. Does it feel spooky to you?
No, but I'm not in touch with those things. Nothing feels spooky to me.
Okay.
So I'm just not.
Does it feel spooky to you?
But Linda's a lot more sensitive to those types of things.
Different feeling than spooky.
Yeah.
There is a feeling here. I mean, it's not really a despair feeling. I wouldn't know even how to describe it. It's peaceful to me. It's not scary. The technologies that were used here, people can't see my facial expressions, but my facial expressions, I'm sure, have been just all across the board, from something kind of humorous to just totally appalled that this would happen.
I'm sure the cameras caught a few of mine.
So, yeah, I mean, there's that aspect of it, but at the same time, it's not a place that I would stay away from because there's a bad feeling here. Not at all.
Yeah, it's a very good feeling. I think, if anything, I would say people want their stories to be told, want the stories to be told.
I would agree with that.
We've never had anything malicious happen with our ghost. We've had experiences where people have been told to get out, but those are people that are being
disrespectful.
Yeah, aggressive or have a weird energy. Yeah, and then ghosts will say get out. And we've had young girls, usually teenage girls, that have come on experiences, have sometimes gotten scratched, which is just a thing. We usually tell people if they're coming with teenage girls, or if they're a teenage girl that's coming for a paranormal experience, that is something that has happened. But other than that, there's nothing mean. It's there, and sometimes I think that they'll have good experience, they're just talking back and forth with the ghost through machines and things like that.
Interesting.
They tend to find all sorts of things. So
cool. Okay, well, now we're down in the basement.
Okay.
And it looks to me like we've got another long hallway with a lot of different apparatuses, from saddle making, vices, to plows, to forge for blacksmith, weather vanes that have a Model T on the front and a cow on the front. And you've got a seat over here with, I don't know what the heck of it is. It looks like a banjo that you would work on a work table. That is a pedal-powered scroll saw.
Uh-huh.
That's what it is. Yep. Okay, it took me a minute,
but
I finally got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can sit in your seat and then do your scroll saw work. Now, was this stuff that the patients were able to use as part of their therapy and doing their art?
Yeah, so as I said before, the state hospital was completely self-sufficient. We were 100% farm to table. So everything that was made here was used here. Everything that they needed, they made here. So we had a whole farm, and we had a metal shop, we had a carpentry shop, So if you were a patient, your job was to get up and help, right? And that was the only way that the state hospital could function. So that's a good thing. If you're sick and you're laying in bed all the time, right? Eventually you got to get up. And so that was one of the things. They're just getting people up and around and giving them purpose and something to do. And so that's
purpose is important.
Yeah, that's a very powerful thing. And it allowed for us to have this state-funded hospital that was able to function. But here's the thing. Could that system be abused?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So for many years, our number one occupations for men were farmers. Number one occupation for women was housewife, because that's what we had in Northwest Missouri. And so the patients that were here were farmers and housewives. So the guys would work on the farms, the women would work in the kitchens and help clean and do all of that stuff. But like, say you have somebody who's a patient here and they're better, but it's harvest season.
Don't release that guy.
Right.
Especially if he's better and he's a good worker.
Right. So you have a guy that's a really good worker. Do you want to send him back out, or do you want to leave him here? So, there are times where people say it was like kind of forced slavery. Because they couldn't leave, or how would they get out if they were good workers? And so in the 1960s and 70s, when we have those patient right laws go into effect that say informed consent, voluntary versus involuntary confinement, one of the things that also come about is changes in labor laws. And so where patients were expected to get up every day and work all day long, they started to change that and say you had to get paid. They had to pay the patients to work, and they could only work them, a reasonable amount of time, like an 8-hour day versus a 12-hour day. And so because of those changes in labor laws, right, that's one of the reasons our state hospitals were deinstitutionalized, because without the labor of the patients, they couldn't afford to operate. There were many other reasons, but that was definitely one of them, is the unintended consequences of laws that were necessary to protect patients.
But what about the positive consequences of if they had a commissary here and they were able to make even 10 cents an hour, but buy a package of M&Ms, let's say, for a nickel, at least they would be able to feel self-worth from having accomplished the work and being able to purchase.
Yeah. So when we have those laws go into effect, we switch over from this style of farm-to-table subsistence at the state hospital to something that's called sheltered workshops, and we have an exhibit on that over there. And then they start doing work and getting paid, and then they could go and spend their money at the commissary. And so they definitely switch over.
Did they see an improvement in the attitudes or self-worth of the patients at that point in time? Do you know that? I would think that would be a natural side effect.
People like to have their own money and like to work and feel involved and not be forced to work.
Or even a sense of accomplishment with having earned your own money.
But so like if you're saying we have 3,000 patients plus doctors and nurses, and we have to feed them every day. And what we were doing up to that point was having them do the farming and the cooking and all of that. And then all of a sudden that labor pool goes away.
Right.
How do you keep a hospital running? So it became very difficult to continue to do what they were doing in the same way. So it just really shifts the state hospital. So farm to table, that's what this basically is all of the stuff and the patients are doing. Like these are patients as well as workers at the state hospital working side by side. You can't tell who's who.
Right. And they're picking cabbage, it looks like, or spinach or
green
something.
Beans or
maybe beans. They're picking something out of the field. They've got a mule team with a buckboard wagon.
We had an award-winning dairy.
Oh, really? They've got a cream separator here and a cream can and several milk jugs. Lambs. Those are lambs. Yeah, it looks like beans in this picture.
Yeah. We made our own shoes, our old prosthesis legs.
Really? So you had real skilled labor here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Farming. This was the cellar where they would store the food for the winter. This is processing beans.
Right.
In 1940s. And again, these are patients, right?
And you've got a big wheel stone for sharpening the farm tools and stuff.
Apples. So our patients would have been picking the apples.
So you must have had a really nice apple orchard here at one point.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Big orchard.
Is it still here, or have the trees all...
Part of it is going to be on prison land. And then, like, this is pies. Like, imagine how much it took to cook for everybody. So it was just a huge, huge, huge operation.
Wow.
So
this is so interesting that they were able to basically be self-sufficient.
Yeah. So, like, this is a gigantic cooking vessel.
And when she says gigantic, she's talking about a 4-foot round pot with a lid on it. Wow. And it's probably 2.5 foot deep. You could put a lot of soup in there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So here's some statistics that I think are interesting. In 1919, the State Hospital in Nevada, Missouri, which is kind of just a little bit smaller than ours in St. Joseph, consumed 390 gallons of milk a day.
Whoa.
4,779 dozen eggs a year. And then in 1947, they peeled 700 to 800 pounds of potatoes per meal.
Per meal.
And made 150 gallons of gravy and baked 600 to 700 loaves of bread a day.
A day.
600
to 700 loaves of bread a day.
A day.
Wow. The workforce, like you were saying, had to have been huge to supply that.
Yes. So these state hospitals were really providing a lot of jobs for communities as well as a place for people to go. So we weren't always just taking care of people who were mentally ill. We know we had patients who had syphilis. We know we had patients who had tuberculosis. We had a lot of addiction issues, but we also served just basically as a nursing home. So people who were older, who couldn't take care of themselves, who were senile, maybe had dementia. We took care of all of that population.
Well, it just seems like that workforce would be so hard to draw from the patient aspect. I mean, some of these patients should have been able to hold down an outside job if they're doing the work that they had to do here.
Possibly. We had a lot of interaction between the Buchanan County Poor Farm and the state hospital. So somebody could have ended up here, but then gotten better enough that they could start getting back out to work. So they would go to the poor farm and work at the poor farm. And then if they could do that, then they could go back out to the community, or they would go from the poor farm to here. So there was kind of a back and forth between that.
Now we've got a couple of automobiles in here.
Yes.
What is the Wow. What's the significance here?
So I mentioned upstairs, we always had children at the state hospital.
Right.
So some of them were born here. So we could have had patients that came when they were pregnant. They could have had patients who got pregnant while they were here. We could have had people who dropped off their kids here because maybe they had Down syndrome or something else going on. Woodson's Children's Psychiatric Hospital was the children's wing of the hospital where they would raise the kids. A lot of the kids ended up here because they couldn't function in the St. Joseph School District or in their homes. So some of them could have had incredibly high intelligence IQs. Some of them could have had low IQs. Some of them could have had autism or just a dysfunctional family life. So some of the kids just probably didn't have a good home life and would have ended up here. Part of their schooling was to do therapy, occupational therapy, and so these are vehicles that were made by the kids at Woodson.
These are phenomenal.
Yeah.
We've got a Monte Carlo here that has a big old blower on it. This thing had to have been fast. The front bumper is made out of wood. The seats inside are all velvet. The back seat, the Monte Carlo had a back seat in it, but this thing here is all velvet, tuck and roll, wood dash. Boy, this thing is just beautiful. Must have had hydraulics or something in it because it's got all kinds of switches and gauges, and this thing is phenomenal. It's better than almost anything I've ever seen in a car show. This thing is so cool. The back bumper's made out of wood. The Chevy Insignias are made out of wood. The pickup that's here, it says jukebox on it, so I'm assuming it's got speakers all through the bed that tilt up. I think it had to have made a lot of noise.
I think so. It's called
and again,
Jukebox Hero.
The interior, it's got a phone in it, an old an old car phone that was probably 1980s style. And it's a pickup. The top's been cut off, so it's a convertible. Dang, the paintwork and stuff is just unbelievable on both of these cars. They're beautiful. And high school kids built these.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
It's even got velvet over the engine on the bottom of the hood where the hood shuts down over the engine. Amazing. Just absolutely amazing.
Pretty cool stuff.
Yes.
So this is the laundry. 20 tons of laundry a week was processed by patients.
20 tons.
Yeah. And that laundry was hot, especially in the summer. But look at that big old.
Yeah, it's showing piles of clothes. Now, you've got an old wringer type washer in here and stuff. I'm sure that's not what they were doing. Well, they had to have been doing their 20 tons of laundry on that
Some of
prior
it.
to.
Yeah. And then this is sheltered workshop. And these are some examples of things that the patients did that they got paid for in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. We had Trapper Keeper. Mead had a company here in St. Joseph, and Nomo Lights was a big company here. And Hilliard's, they would make things for Hilliard's.
Noma lights. Now that was Christmas lights.
Christmas lights, yep.
And so they would send the patients out to these companies to work, or the companies
would bring stuff here.
They would bring stuff here.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Together checking Christmas lights. Fishing lures, bad.
Bad.
Bad Christmas lights.
Fishing lures, they made those here too.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Yeah. And then this is the sewing room, the weaving.
And you've got sewing machines, and what kind of a machine is that back there? A material cutter? It's got a bunch of little...
I think it would embroider labels.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
And a weaving room with rugs that they were weaving on a loom.
Yep.
Barber chairs.
Yep. And then this is the physical therapy room, exactly as they left it when they moved out in 1993 and moved across the street.
Okay.
97. And so, you see a gigantic bathtub that would have been used for therapy and other things, and all this was physical therapy.
Okay, so it wasn't the freeze treatments and the boil treatments and all of those kind of things.
A little bit more modern treatments, yes.
Wow.
And then in here is the morgue and autopsy room.
Oh, okay. And you've got the morgue refrigerator.
Yep, 4 of them.
Four of them, yes.
4-seater.
It's a nice refrigerator. I'm sure they probably used that when the pies were needing to be kept to the next day.
Probably not. Probably not. This was just used for patients. Whenever they died, they would bring them in here, and then they often autopsy them to see how they passed away. So that's the autopsy room. They would also use this in St. Joseph, like if there was a suspicious death in the city, they would use it. So I think in the 1990s, there was a family of 4 that were murdered. That was the last time this was used. They brought them here.
Okay, now did they have a coroner that worked just at the hospital, or did they use the county coroner office?
They would have had their own person here.
Their own person?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. And then this is the autopsy room, and that's the autopsy table.
There's an autopsy table with a mannequin, I'm hoping, underneath the sheet. It's all covered up, but it's got the sinks and everything that you would need, I guess, for doing autopsies. Now, did they use this also for embalming and stuff too, or maybe they didn't embalm?
So there's a funeral home right across the street, and often we would send our patients over there. So they have a lot of the records from that.
Wow.
Yeah. So in researching this, we looked at sort of the death certificates for patients who passed away at the hospital. And so we talked about like natural deaths, like we would expect heart attacks and strokes, and we would have epidemics of like tuberculosis or pneumonia that would go through the hospital. Right. This was our toothbrush holder. So you can clearly see how if somebody had tuberculosis, everybody would get tuberculosis.
Yeah, this toothbrush holder has room for probably 50 toothbrushes, all hanging on a little hook and all hanging right down next to each other. And so I guess you went and took your toothbrush off and then hung it back up when it was wet, and germs probably passed all over the place on that.
Yeah. And then we would have some accidental deaths, like, somebody would go to take the trash out and get burned up in the incinerator. We had one year where we had several patients that choked on peach seeds, which I thought was very weird. People just fall and, they would hurt themselves, or, they'd be working out on the farm maybe and something would happen. So, and then we have intentional deaths where people were either committing suicide, swallowing arsenic, or people were murdered, like other patients murdered other patients. Right. Things happened here.
Wow.
So there were, I think you can really get a good sense of what life was like at the state hospital by looking at the death certificates and what was causing people to die. Some of it was, pretty scary. Like one patient hit another patient over the head with a shovel because they got in a fight when they were out on the farm. Things like that.
But that happens even if they're not mental patients.
Oh yeah, totally. So when we say hair on fire upstairs, I really believe she saw somebody with their hair on fire. And then these are headstones. So we have about 2,000 people that are interred in the cemetery.
Here on the grounds?
It's actually on the prison grounds more now. There's a marker over there that you can go to the marker, but then past it, the cemetery, there's a creek, and there's like the first 100 oldest markers are on this side of the creek, and then on the other side of the creek on prison land, there's a lot more. They used to bury them all with markers, but then in the 1960s, they just pushed the markers over and sodded over them because they didn't want to mow around them. Ugh. So a lot of the markers you can't see them, but they gave them a number, so they didn't put their names on it so that people didn't know who was buried there. They just gave them each a number.
Huh. That's interesting.
Well, it's because there was such a stigma against mental illness. And so, like, if you're Wilson and you have a bunch of Wilsons buried in the state hospital, they're going to say, oh, all those Wilsons are crazy. So they would just give them a number so they wouldn't know who was. Do you guys want to see the tunnel?
Yes! I want to see everything. The tunnel.
So all of the buildings that are part of the state hospital system are connected via a tunnel. They would transport patients and laundry and food and everything through those tunnels, because sometimes the weather is not very nice in Missouri.
Yeah.
Okay.
So our south building has actually 3 tunnels that go off of it. We have one that's open to the public because it has patient art on it, murals that the patients made.
Now, is this part that's open to the public for the most part, or?
Yeah, so anybody who comes, if they want to see the tunnel, they just need to stop in and ask at the front desk, and we will be happy to take them over.
Okay.
This building was built in 1923. It's called the Pantier Building. It was the original medical and surgical building for the hospital.
Okay.
This tunnel connects to the Park Building, which is the large X-shaped building. And that was the maximum secure facility for the patients.
Oh, wow.
At one point in time. So they would lock this door and let them come down and paint down here. The tunnel's twice as long as what you actually see. It's walled off at the prison grounds.
Okay.
You're welcome to go down. It will be very echoey if I talk, so I'm going to let you just walk.
Wow. So they just came down here and painted the murals. Mm-hmm. Did they just leave paints down here for, or are these several thick, or is the mural that we see the only one that's there? I'm
guessing that this is the only one that's there. They did this in it's not super old, 1980s, early 90s, and it was part of their art therapy.
Okay. And we're looking at murals that are they're probably 20 feet long, and they're floor to ceiling. The top in here is only probably 6'6" tall in this tunnel. But we've got a mural of a lighthouse with some men in a tent that look like they're probably on a fishing trip, a fishing guy, several boats, a guy swimming next to his boat.
So this is a series of 4 murals, and they each represent a season. So it's fall, winter, spring, and summer.
Okay. And then the next one has kites and hot air balloons floating in the air. And this must be the summer one. The winter one has some mountains, trees, a frozen lake, snow, and then we've got trees with lots of different colors of leaves and all that. So this one must be fall. Mm-hmm. Wow. And we're still walking, looking down the right-hand side. We've got a scene with some mountains and some giraffes. This is all African. Another one with monkeys, elephants, trees, lions, tigers. This is really, really neat artwork as you walk down through the tunnel. And these tunnels, how many miles of tunnels is there underneath all these buildings?
Oh my goodness, I couldn't even begin to imagine. It's a huge site.
Is it a tornado?
I think so.
It looks like a tornado. Wow. 4th of July, we got all kinds of fireworks, rockets going off over a city and a big American flag. Kids playing basketball in a park with slide and swings, cars. A flower scene with a sunrise. A rainy day with people with umbrellas and getting wet, running through puddles and cars.
Okay, describe this side.
Now I'm working back up the other side. We got tulips, a house scene, a horse. Now, is that a rat? What kind of a critter is that? With
These
the
are much
sunshine?
more abstract.
These ones here are definitely a lot more abstract. And some kind of bird, a house with a chimney and smoke coming out, a couple of crosses. Boy, yeah, this one's too abstract for me to describe. I always say that I will never do an art museum because I have to try and describe some paintings that I'm looking at, and I could never do them justice. So, but this is just amazing.
The kids, when they come, the students, they love it when they come down here and we turn the lights out on them. They always ask us to do that, so it's like pitch black.
So it's pitch black, except for the ghost that's standing down at the end. I'd put one down there just for the heck of it.
Yeah, so you have not lived until you hear 20 middle school girls in pitch black tunnels scream, ah, as soon as the lights go out.
Well, you could put your earplugs on first.
It's really an experience.
Wow. This is just such an amazing museum, covering such an amazing topic.
It's very unique. There's nothing like it in the world.
No, there's not. And it's just everything about it. There's so much mystery. There really is. This is a museum that answers a lot of questions that nobody wants to talk about. So it's hidden, it's suppressed, it's a mystery. Mm-hmm. And you have been so good at answering so many questions. Your understanding of what happened here is just amazing.
Well, we try to really talk about the history of the treatment of mental illness because there's such a stigma that still exists in the United States. And, you know, in order for us to move forward in healthy, smart ways, we really need to have some good conversations and work towards breaking that stigma.
Oh, definitely.
Now more, I think, than ever, because we're starting to understand, you know, how so many different things impact our brains. And I think now that we have a much better understanding, we could do better to move forward.
We should be able to do better. It's a travesty as you drive around through these cities and see the mental illness displayed on the street. I mean, you have your beggars that stand at the corner trying to get a buck. Some of them, I don't know how legit they are or illegit. I'm not going to pass judgment on that. But then you see the people that are really in despair, that aren't standing on the corner, that are having major problems. And what do you do about all of that? It's a major issue in our country right now.
Well, I think that if we can be more educated ourselves, as we talked about earlier, everybody knows somebody who has a mental illness. And so we're kind of supporting those people if they're our friends and our family and our loved ones. And so for us to be able to support them and help them get better, we have to understand what's going on.
Right.
And because we're afraid to talk about it so often in the United States, we don't look it in the eye, we don't understand it because there is such a stigma, we're doing a very bad job supporting those people that need help. And they're people that we love and want to help, but we haven't been able to get good answers. And so a lot of us are just confused, like, what do? I don't know what to do. Where do we get help? Where do we get access? What do we do to prevent this for our kids and our future generations? And so I think the more people can come here and see, what our current knowledge and understanding is about, what's causing mental illness, what's making it worse in our society, and look at some coping strategies, some things that we can do to make it better, the better suited we are to move forward in healthy ways for our communities and our population.
Right.
Look, I do think that we can do better in the United States. We ought to be doing better.
I think we can do better as human beings, but like you said, I don't know how to help.
Yeah.
Paying for somebody to go see a psychiatrist doesn't necessarily equate to mental health.
Right.
So, anyway, Sarah, I have so enjoyed this part of our day. I'm looking forward to a couple of other hours with you if that's at all possible, and going into a couple of different podcasts. This is probably my longest podcast. I don't know if I'll end up having to break it into 2 pieces or not, but this has been so educational, so fascinating. The 2.5 hours has gone by so quickly, and I know we've talked a lot around different areas besides just what's here at the museum. But again, I appreciate it. You have a website that will get you here, the directions. You guys have some construction going on, which was kind of frustrating this morning as far as getting here, but your website is? www.stjosephmuseum.org. Okay.
And that's a great way to get information. We also have 4 Facebook pages.
4?
Mm-hmm.
One for each museum?
Yeah, so one is for the Glore Psychiatric Museum. We have a St. Joseph Museum Facebook page. We have a Black Archives Museum Facebook page, and we have a Waiatuttle Mansion Facebook page.
Okay. Well, we're gonna talk about some of those other ones. So anyway, I like to finish out my podcasts by saying the world is full of wonder. People need to get out and explore. And I can't even begin to add on to get out and explore when it comes to this museum. There's so much to see, so much emotion. I mean, really, there's emotion when you're standing there looking at lobotomy equipment or the cold bath therapies or whatever. There's emotion that wells up in you that I don't think you can get by sitting and watching this on TV. And everybody have an absolutely wonder-filled day.
All the roll and go, where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?